Hey, ladies and gentlemen, Jeremy Harrell here. I just want to go through as briefly as I can anyway. As you can see, I've got a lot of notes here. And everybody's wondering, is it possible for President Trump to abolish the IRS without going through Congress? Can he do it unilaterally through some kind of an executive order or with the Treasury Department? And is it possible? Can we replace the IRS, which is the Internal Revenue Service, which we are working blood, sweat, and tears, giving all our money to the government? Or can Donald Trump replace the Internal Revenue Service income with an External Revenue Service income? Well, there is a wonderful man by the name of Anthony E. Parent, okay? And we reached out to Anthony E. Parent for clarification. He is a tax scholar and a tax attorney, okay? And what he says is, in part, yes, Donald Trump could possibly do this without going through Congress. Now, ultimately, the best thing would be to go through Congress. You don't need 2/3 or anything like that. You just need to pass the bill. The best thing would be to go through Congress and have them legislatively define the one thing that is causing all the problem here. The U.S. tax code was done in such a secretive move in Congress that they never put it out for public scrutiny. And since they did that, they never defined what or who an individual is. And we're going to start with that and come back with that full circle in the end. I took a bunch of notes here getting this information, so bear with me as I read through my bullet points. Okay? The U.S. individual income tax law lives by regulation, ladies and gentlemen. Remember that. And we know this because it doesn't define what an individual is. And since it doesn't define what an individual is, well, therein lies the problem. That's where regulation takes over. Here we go. A change of law may not be required because it never bothers to define in the U.S. tax code what an individual is. The law doesn't define it. Is an individual somebody living inside the United States? Is it living outside the United States? Is it only men? Is it women? Who are they? What is an individual? The secretive income tax, he says, law was done without public awareness. And because of that, a lot of things were very vague and skipped over, including defining what an individual is. Who decides who an individual is? Well, in this case, because the law doesn't define it, then it must go to the regulator. Who's in charge of those regulations? And in this case, it is the Department of Treasury. So if it lives by regulation, then it could die by regulation, he said. Trump can simply appoint a new Secretary of Treasury to draft new regulations, since Treasury is the definer and the enforcer of the law, not the IRS. When it drafts new regulation, it must follow the Administrative Procedure Act, or the APA, he said, like all other federal agencies do. Now, the APA requires that when an agency drafts new regulation, here's the key, it must engage in a process known as notice and comment. That process includes 3 steps. 1, the agency must publish a notice to the public so that there can be scrutiny and discussion, debate, and argument on this. Number 2, regulations must be in harmony with the statute. Now remember, that's going to be the big one. Regulations must be in harmony with the statute, which goes back to defining what individual income tax is, located in Title 26 of the U.S. tax code. And since it must align with the legislative intent, therein lies the problem. So let's say Trump restricted the income tax to some definition that would make nobody subject to it. It could then be stricken down by the Supreme Court, because you know that there would be a lot of pushback on this from people who are obviously greedy and power hungry. Although all Americans shouldn't want this if we have something that is proposed to replace it. So it could be stricken down by the Supreme Court, because individual could easily be argued as it's clear what an individual is, Your Honors, right? So the argument to that is, okay, is a baby an individual? Are people in a coma an individual, since it's not defined by law? Are foreigners individuals, visa workers, students? Who is individual? You failed to do that when you secretively made the law, right? And the argument to that is, well, what the regulation does is limits the word individual to United States working taxpayer. Ooh. The argument back to that is, since you just said, well, since it's not legislatively defined, and since it goes to the regulator, and the regulation defines who it is and enforces who to go after for these taxes, well, that brings me right back to the beginning. If it lives by regulation, then it can die by regulation. And the argument back to that is, ladies and gentlemen, and really comes down to this, that's just an admission right there that the law does not define who an individual taxpayer is. Regulation does. And right now, the Secretary of Treasury is mandated by Section 7601 of the Internal Revenue Service to canvass America to find Americans who have unreported income tax, which means at any time your right to privacy means nothing to the IRS. Their authority can just run a perpetual campaign to violate your Fourth Amendment. So the Secretary of Treasury, this is by Anthony Parent, says the Secretary of Treasury can then look at that and say, well, the tax code as enforced is in conflict with the Fourth Amendment because it never defines what an individual is. And if I'm the regulator here, it conflicts with the Fourth Amendment, which forbids unreasonable searches and seizures. The Constitution and the Fourth Amendment is the highest law of the land. So because we have a conflict with Title 26 in the Constitution, then the Constitution must prevail. The Treasurer or Secretary could then say that any way to enforce Title 26 is to define the individual that must live and work in the United States. They must consent to the illegal search and seizure. We're making it legal by consenting. So at the very least, ladies and gentlemen, this would expose the politicians and the people that want to keep the IRS tax code, the Internal Revenue Tax Code, in place, and would ultimately give President Trump leverage to actually have this go through Congress and have it passed there as well, because nobody wants to, nobody wants political suicide. So one way or another, he can get this done, and it's not going to be that difficult. I'm sorry it wasn't as brief as I wanted it to be, but share this out everywhere. I would love other tax scholars and tax attorneys to argue this in any way, shape, or form. But it all comes down to this. They never defined individual. And since they didn't define it, then it must go to the regulator, which is the Secretary of Treasury. And they could say, this is in direct conflict with the Fourth Amendment, and we can't illegally search and seizure anybody's property. Let me know what you think. LFA TV, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. We appreciate you. God bless.